Accessing secure channel. The Agent Files, where aspiring agents rise and masters flourish. Powered by Agent Builder Coaching. Mission initiated. File loading.
Hi there, this is Peter Fan for Agent Builder Coaching and the Agent Files, the podcast for agents on a mission. This series is specific for those that are almost agents. So people that have finished all of their educational requirements, or at least the pre-licensing part, and are ready to get their license, but have not actually taken out a license, or they're not actively in real estate quite yet. That's kind of the premise, the outline that we work on in this particular series, because there's a huge difference. So the moment that you're licensed, you can do a whole bunch of things. When you're not licensed, you can't do a number of things, and it's important to recognize the distinction. That doesn't mean that you are not able to learn a lot about the business of real estate at this stage. In fact, it's highly encouraged to do so that the learning curve, once you are licensed, it doesn't feel so overwhelming. So that's really why we're doing this series. And we find it to be very, very helpful for those people that do end up in real estate, so that they don't feel like they're drinking from a fire hose, is one of those comments that we hear a lot. So this week we're talking about automatic transaction machines, what we call ATMs. And the wordplay is not accidental. You do transactions, it becomes the cash flow machine, right? So that's where that comes from. So here's an interesting quote. Couldn't find where it came from, but it's an interesting one. Amateurs practice until they get it right. Professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. Okay? Just think about that for a moment. There's a real big difference in the mindset of the two approaches. And we want you to become a professional, right? To just literally not be able to do it, get it wrong. So why does it matter? Well, it's really where all of your effort comes together into transactions, right? No transactions, no cash flow. Or if a transaction goes sideways, so all of your work that you've done in preparation to either getting a listing or getting an offer in place go to the wayside if that transaction doesn't actually complete, right? And it's any given marketplace, even the busiest of marketplaces, there's always a risk that something goes astray, right? The buyer walks away, the seller changes their mind. There's many reasons why things can go sideways. And the last thing that you ever want to happen, of course, is that it goes sideways because of anything you did or didn't do. Right? That's kind of our biggest fear, I suppose, because it has a lot to do with, obviously, your reputation, your credibility, but also it's a real financial issue, of course. So mistakes are not always what you do, but actually are more often what hasn't been done. And unfortunately, when a buyer wants to buy and a seller wants to sell, there's typically not a whole lot that will happen to make it go wrong. It's when one of the two parties changes their mind and now wants out of a deal or out of a transaction and start involving, lawyers and really becomes quite persistent in saying, hey, we do not want to proceed. It's really hard to keep a deal together. It is, because, provided that you have enough money to take matters to court, it's they'll find a reason. They'll find a way. And you, as the agent, become an easy target because there's so many moving pieces, and the onus on us, the responsibilities on us are quite significant. So lawyers find us an easy target. Plus, we've got very good errors and omissions insurance. So doesn't mean that you did actually anything wrong that caused a transaction to go sideways, but it may still be enough to get their client in the right position again, i.e., if there was any financial losses, that they may be able to recoup those losses and so on and so forth. So our place is always under scrutiny, and because we are the professionals, we are held to a much higher standard than the consumers. So again, one more reason to say, okay, what can we do to become really professional, really proficient in dealing with everything that has to do with transactions? Well, practice is a really good way. Practice, and what I mean by that is to literally walk through listings, through sales as a contractual set of process. Right? What do you do in order to take a listing? What research do you prepare for? How much detail do you need? Where are you getting it from, and so on and so forth. So that becomes part of your transactional operations and your transaction machine. And that's why we call it a transaction machine. So transactions are very much a repeatable process. And once you figured it out, and once you have gone through a number of transactions, the repetitiveness of the process, not necessarily the terms and conditions, but the process will remain relatively the same. And yes, there is incidental changes to paperwork and contracts and process. And, over the years, we've added a whole bunch of new bits and pieces to it. Right? But when I started in real estate, most contracts were 2, maybe 3 pages. Now, if we see a contract of purchase and sale, a sales contract, and it's less than 20 pages, you go like, what's missing? Did we forget something? Right? And particularly when it gets involved with strata properties, or condominiums, townhouses, duplexes. The Strata Property Act just stipulates that all of the paperwork that is involved with the strata becomes part of the transaction. So it becomes quite a bit of reading, quite a bit of materials that people rely upon to make their purchase and sale decisions. So everything becomes important. And yeah, we oftentimes have to read all of that stuff to be aware of what is and what isn't taking place in it. Now, do we have to be an expert on it all? No, but you need to know enough to say, hey, this could be a red flag, and then defer to experts and specialists. And in some cases, you can hire third-party services to review stuff, like lawyers and notaries and or strata documentation review companies. But it doesn't mean that you have kind of washed your hands from all responsibility. Not at all. If you ought to have known, then you ought to have known. Okay, so the steps in transactions is typically this, right? There's a prospect, a lead, an inquiry that becomes a consultation. Consultation then can lead to some form of agreement, whether it's written or otherwise. With buyers, the norm still tends to be that we don't have a buyer agency agreement. I don't agree with it, but that's just the norm. That seems to be the common thing. I would encourage you to start thinking about having buyer agency agreements in place, very much like you would have listing agency agreement in place. And so when you're working on the seller side, obviously you start then marketing that listing. You prepare it for the market, get photographs done, and so on and so forth. And you arrange the showings for that listing. Or if you're working with a buyer, then obviously you would arrange showings with that buyer of properties that the buyer may be interested in. And at some point in time, there's an offer, right? You are either, as a buyer agent, writing the offer for a property that your buyer wants to buy, or when you're working with the seller, you're looking at offers that come in with the seller and reviewing what's good, bad, or indifferent about it, and then going over all the terms and conditions with them. Now, that offer can bounce back and forth and counter offers and what have you. And if all goes well, it becomes a contract. Now, in most contracts, there is a subject to period or due diligence period, whichever way you want to call that. And then at some point in time, the conditions are removed. There's a whole bunch of other paperwork involved, like deposits and FinTrack and conveyancing documents and what have you. And then it goes to closing, and then, people get paid out, title transfers. And then, of course, your client, whether it was the seller, they may end up also having bought something. So that may be the other side of that situation. Or if you were working with the buyer, then obviously what kind of post-closing follow-up do you have? Which is not necessarily transactional anymore, but it's still, you're building on future relationship and potential future referral. So the need to have an ongoing process for that in place is absolutely essential. Okay. So each step has tasks, timelines, documents, responsibilities, obligations, sensitivities, confidentialities, and so on and so forth. So all of those steps are quite important. And building that as a proper process, SOP, this is basically an extension of a chapter that we talked about earlier, but it's very specific and focused on the transactional side of things. Right? We talked earlier on a section about standard operating procedure or systematized operating procedure. Well, transaction systems are very much part of that, right? And some of it absolutely involves you, particularly when it goes to contractual stuff and agency and what have you. But some of it is more administrative. And so some of those steps can actually be delegated quite nicely, quite easily. Okay? And again, preparation and practicing that can be a really good use of your time before your license. Now, I'm going to preface this section a little bit because not everywhere is it even remotely acceptable to ask for shadowing. Okay. You can ask for it, but you need to do that through the managing broker of the brokers that you're contemplating to work with. An agent that you know may be willing to do that, but keep in mind that this is very much potentially involving clients, actual clients, right? The shadowing means that you're going to be there at presentations or what have you with real people, real clients in real situations. And I got to tell you that there are a good number of clients that are not comfortable with that. So that you need to have absolute consent, and you cannot be asking for that. The agent needs to be asking for that. And the brokerage may have an issue with that because technically you're not licensed, you're not under their auspices and supervision. So they may feel that it is inappropriate. So this absolutely has to be cleared before you do anything like this. But notwithstanding that part, there are some things that you can absolutely do for sure. You can do mock listing presentations to your family, to your neighbors, to friends that are close, just as a role play type exercise. Other people that are students in the course. If you work with companies like ourselves, like coaching organizations or training organizations, they will oftentimes make time available for that type of thing. Open houses, you can obviously go and visit open houses and observe, right? You can learn a lot. Showings, again, that really requires shadowing, so that's it's a little bit less likely. But if you have an agent that's going to preview a property without clients, then that may be an opportunity to tag along. And as long as the seller has said okay, so the buyer agent can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to preview a property," and then have you come along, because for all intents and purposes, the consumer may get the impression that that the property is now being shown to a third party, and that's not the impression that you want to create. Okay. Transaction coordination meetings, obviously, you can look at some of the paperwork, but there is transactional confidentiality. You are not a licensed realtor. There's agency relationships in place, so the names and information and data on actual contracts is confidential information. It's none of your business. And the consumers affected by that, if they were aware of that, are they okay with it? So getting permission to do that definitely has to come from the clients as well as from the brokerage. Okay. And closing day client handoffs, is probably okay. Probably people are not going to be too worried about it most of the time. But again, you should get permission on that. Okay. Again, you cannot act as an agent, therefore you cannot sign contracts or advice. None of that can happen, of course. But here's some of the stuff that you can do is do role plays, right? You can do role plays with pretty much anybody. You're just role playing. It's just practice. So if you if you can set it up with people that either have real estate experience or are active realtors and you role play with them, that's great. Um, Peers, family members, uh, just set out scenarios, situational type role plays. Hey, you're a reluctant seller and I'm going to do a listing presentation, or you're a reluctant buyer and I want to enter into a buyer agency relationship. So how do you present that? What do you say? What do you do? Okay, so you can role play those things quite nicely. You can write mock contracts, listings as well as purchases. So I would inevitably start where you already live. So the home that you live in, pretend that you're now going to buy it or rebuy it. Huh? Go write an offer on that property. Right? Follow the steps. Or find your dream home. No, any house that you see, pretend that you're going to buy it. Okay, what you need to do? Do an evaluation on it. Get the stats together. Now you're doing it for yourself, and then keep all the data together, right? And maybe your mentor, your sponsor in the company that you're working with us, or maybe you can find a managing broker that is willing to review that with you pre you getting licensed with them. If you make that commitment to the brokerage, you're going to find some resistance there, but some managing brokers may be willing to do that. Okay, and again, but it's you taking the initiative to practice these things in advance of you being licensed, because all of this you will need to learn at some point in time. So doing this early on just helps you get over that hurdle of not being familiar, and so you're basically extending and expanding your knowledge dramatically even before your license, and it's very, very confidence building, and it makes your life so much easier once you actually are licensed, right? Then of course you can draft all the listing marketing ideas and models and what have you. You can go into Canva, start creating stuff, or whatever desktop publishing software that you may have. And then, yes, build a transaction checklist for both listings as well as buyers, referrals, closing checklist, and so on and so forth, or for open houses and what have you, right? So it is a simulation type drill, right? Pick a sample property, pick one. It really doesn't matter. Just pick one, okay? If you are able to go through, then great. If not, then okay. Do it hypothetically, right? You can do all kinds of research online, even without the MLS system, by the way. You can do lots of research on properties. So then draft a CMA in the market evaluation. Role play the listing presentation with somebody, right? Create a marketing checklist. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to present the property to the marketplace. And then continue on in receiving an offer on the property and walking it through to the close, and then flip the scenario next time that you practice it. Now pretend to be the buyer agent, right? So that you go through the same exercise on a few properties from both sides, and write the offers. Write the offers, right? Review the offers. Understand what is necessary, what the scenario is, what forms you need, what paperwork is important, right? The opportunity of learning this now will help you dramatically understand the sequences and the process and the steps, but it also will take a lot of the anxiety away of, oh my God, somebody wants to buy a house now, right? If the first time that you actually deal with that is a real situation, that's not particularly healthy. That's not particularly confidence building for yourself. Just pretend that you're really working with a buyer, and how are they going to feel if you show up and you've never actually written the contract? That's just, how's the buyer going to feel? Right? So the more you practice that, the better it is. Okay. I hope that makes sense. So again, simulations are a really good way to do it in a safe environment, but be open to blunt criticism. Right? The best way to learn is to somebody ripping it apart and say, you forgot this, you didn't look at this, right? The website of BCFSA actually has some really good preparatory materials about writing and preparing both listings as well as. So they have a guide called Working with Buyers. They also have a guide called Working with Sellers. Now that is BCFSA, as in British Columbia Real Estate Financial Services Authority. If you are in a different jurisdiction, look for your provincial regulator because they will have similar type resources available somewhere. Okay. Every province will have slightly different requirements there, but by and large, they are going to be relatively similar. Okay. So action items: arrange for showing for shadowing if allowed. Okay. Obviously with a licensed mentor, but I'm not going to say that that's going to happen. But if you can get it approved, it would be a really good thing to be able to do. Okay. Then draft at least 2 transaction checklists, one for buyers, one for sellers, right? And I'm just giving you the hint as to where to find something like that and to absolutely review it. Particularly the buyer one that is on the BCFSA website is very detailed. And a lot of that also kind of applies to the seller when you think about it. Right? Because if the buyer wants to know, guess what? The seller ought to have it or ought to be able to provide it. So if you're the agent for the seller and you look at the buyer checklist, that might be the stuff that you need to collect yourself as the listing agent to make sure that the buyer gets it. There's a duty to disclose, right? Keep this in mind. This is a very important notion in law that there's a duty to disclose. So. And then start journaling what you felt most comfortable about or what you're uncomfortable with, uncertain about. Okay. If you can do between now and you getting licensed 1 full transaction, so from listing all the way through completion, from buyer, from lead to all the way through to completion, at least 1 a week of each, then you're well on your way to become quite comfortable relatively soon. And that may seem like a lot of work, but that's the point. Right? That is kind of the point. This is the job. Is getting really, really good at dealing with contracts. So we're going to refer back to some books that we've already talked about. Your First Year in Real Estate by Derek Seller doesn't really talk a lot about the details of the transaction. In general terms, yes, absolutely. There's talking about the process and all that. In your jurisdiction, the details will be different, right? And Derek Seller's book is an American book. Right? I'm just telling you that up front. So their completion and closing processes in the United States are entirely different from what happens in Canada. So you have to take that information with a little bit of a grain of salt, but in general, it's not all bad. BCFSA has some really good information on their website. CREA, the Canadian Real Estate Association, also has some really good information with guides and resources. So again, they are the regulators, provincially, nationally. If you're in a different jurisdiction, go to the regulator of that particular province. Look for, any kind of support resources and materials that is available that deals with preparing homes and properties and relationship with sellers for sale. And then also on the flip side, working with buyers and what is required and what the protocols and rules and regulations say about that and how to then fill in the blanks as you go through it. Okay. That's on a fairly high level of, being able to rely on this stuff. If you follow exactly what the regulator wants, at least on a legal sense of the way, you're never going to make a mistake. So that's pretty solid that you can kind of prevent most of the challenges right from the word go. Now, there may still be other things that, a court may have an issue with or a client may have an issue with, but at least if you can show without a shadow of a doubt, hey, I followed the stipulated guidelines and here's the evidence of that, you can look up and be proud of what you've done to get to that point. So, okay, and lastly, the Millionaire Real Estate Agent book doesn't really necessarily go into the details again, but it does very much talks about the processes and the procedural side of things, not so much the regulatory side of things. Okay, so those are some recommended reading, and that is all for this week's episode. I'm going to kind of give you a little bit more of a few suggestions as to what you can do. Okay, because part of the homework, part of the research, is understanding everything there is to understand about the property. Right? It doesn't necessarily matter whether you're working with a buyer or a seller. You have the same duty of care and responsibility to find out whether you work with one or the other. Now, many buyer agents have a tendency to rely heavily on what the listing agent provides, but that doesn't guarantee that they have done all of the homework. So you wouldn't want to rely on it blindly. You want to, inspect what you expect. So if you've done your due diligence and you have your checklist and you've got your materials that you want or need in order to support your client to the best of your ability, then you verify whatever you've received and whatever is in your checklist and say, oh, I've got some gaps, I've got some missing pieces. Now, where are you going to go and find all of that material? That becomes part of your homework as well. Right. So, for example, and just tossing a few edges, you don't have to remember this, but it's part of that kind of due diligence sequence. For example, a house with a fireplace, a wood-burning fireplace, or a wood stove, or inserts, or what have you. Well, the chimney has to be certified, and it's done through the fire department typically, or a chimney sweep can certify, but typically the fire department does an inspection and says, yeah, it's wet certified, WETT certified. It's just one little bit that you're not necessarily going to find in all properties, but when it applies, it's kind of an important one. Okay, manufactured homes have a whole different set of parameters attached to them that is very significant and changes the dynamics of what you need to search for and where you're going to find all this information, how you're going to deal with it. So, and so on and so forth. You're not always going to deal with title property. What I mean by that sometimes you're going to be dealing with a co-op or with a leasehold, right? Well, it changes the paperwork and what you need to find and what you need to search for. New construction, new home warranty situation. They are different type of parameters, different rules, certifications that is necessary to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed so that the home warranty is actually legal and properly registered so that your client who is buying that property does in fact have a new home warranty on that home, right? And so on and so forth. So lots and lots of things to think about, but all part of things that you can maybe spend a little bit of time on in doing your due diligence and your research early on. Hope that makes some sort of sense. And this is all really very much transactional, as you understand, right? Without some of this stuff, you just are never entirely certain that you've covered all the bases. Okay. I hope this was helpful and informative. You can learn a lot of this stuff before you are licensed. And like I said, doing these mock contracts, listing contracts, sales contracts, before you get licensed will make you much more comfortable and confident as to what to deal with when the real transactions, the real listings come about. Right? At least you will be familiar with all the paperwork, which is a very important part to all of it. Okay. All right. I hope you enjoyed this and that it was informative for you. If any questions come up, you can always reach out, and looking forward to seeing you at the next episode of the Agent Files, where agents come together with a mission. Take care. All the best. Have a fantastic week.
File saved. The Agent Files. For more missions, agents' tools, and tactical strategies, subscribe and follow the Agent Files, powered by Agent Builder Coaching. Until next time, stay sharp. Your next mission awaits.